Even the author of Revelation had no knowledge that Christians were persecuted for the fire.
Dr. Richard Carrier, Christian persecution, right? My friend Roland, of course, another question continues in our last episode. So be sure to watch the other one if you want to deep dive into the Pliny side and burning of Rome. His question, and it's titled, "No mention of the persecution by Nero in any early Christian works." The first time the Tacitus reference to the immense slaughter of Christiani is used in the 5th century by Sulpicius Severus, which you mentioned last time, not even by Eusebius. It would have been a great proselytizing material for early apologists. It is not mentioned at the end of Acts, which does refer to Jews being expelled from Rome under Claudius, nor in the apocryphal Acts of Paul or Peter, which all were written at least as late as the 2nd century, so long after the Annals were written. Is that not very curious?
Yeah. Yeah, this is something that I brought out in a peer-reviewed article many years ago. It comes up again in my new book, The Obsolete Paradigm of a Historical Jesus, because Margaret Williams tries to rehabilitate this. But one of the things that she really glosses over is the most important evidence for this is the massive silence on this. Like Tacitus basically accuses the Christians of the equivalent of 9/11, right? Like burning down Rome, mass murder, all of this stuff. And no one's heard of it for, until the 5th century, right? Like, I think it's not the 5th century, but it's anyways, till like the end of the 4th century, right? And so how does that happen? How does everybody, and it's worth pointing out, like we can't just gloss over this, right? What I got to do is I got to go through all of the examples. So let's go through all the examples. Pliny the Younger's never heard of it. We talk about this in a whole other chat. So people who want to go into the whole Pliny the Younger part of it.
What is it for the audience? What is it they haven't heard of?
The burning of Rome. That the Christians were accused of burning Rome, and that Nero persecuted the Christians for the burning of Rome. Right. So this is in the current text of Tacitus. That is what appears to be said. That the Christians, and he identifies them as those who worship Christ, who was killed by Pontius Pilate, etc. So it seems to be saying that the Christians were blamed, maybe even confessed, to burning Rome down, and were horribly persecuted in these fabulous ways and so on under Nero. So by Nero, right? So this is a huge public event that would be in public memory for generations, right? Like there's no way you just forget about this, right?
Right.
And so we talk about this more. So we would want to see that other chat that we do on Pliny the Younger about this. Like it'll get into more detail on that. I'm just going to go through the list of all the places where this doesn't show up. And then you have to explain, how could Tacitus describe this ridiculously horrific, famous thing that is accusing the Christians of mass murder, etc.? How could no one have heard of it? Not even Christians have heard of it. And so I'll go through the list. But Pliny the Younger, like I said, that's the first one. He has no knowledge of it, and that's not explicable. And people want to see why it's not explicable. That's why I referenced the other chat, because we go into that. Yeah. And we know from him, through the way that he talks about Christians, that his uncle/dad, Pliny the Elder, who wrote this eyewitness history of this event,
never mentions it,
has no knowledge of it, right? Yeah. So that's another thing.
That's someone living closer to 9/11 never mentions anything related.
Yeah, I was there. I lived in Manhattan when 9/11. Really? So yeah, it would be like me forgetting entirely. I don't know why. What's with the Al-Qaeda? I've never heard what they're accused of or why they're dumping. It's it doesn't make any sense, right? It would be illogical. Suetonius. So Suetonius never mentioned this. So Suetonius, he only mentions one persecution under Nero, and he lists the Christians. The Christians were persecuted. He lists it in a list of public morals legislation, right? So he has no knowledge of them being accused of being mass murderers, and he mentions the fire, but he doesn't connect them to the fire, right? So he has no knowledge of Christians being connected to the fire. He has no knowledge of Nero persecuting Christians for the fire. It's not in there. And when he does mention Christians being persecuted, he seems to think that it was just for some sort of public morals thing and not for, mass murder, destroying Rome. It would be like, saying that, and then there was sort of petty persecutions of Al-Qaeda for not eating pork or something like that, right? And but yeah, didn't they just knock the towers down? It would be like, yeah, why didn't they just why would he have it in the list of petty moral stuff when they're mass murderers? It would be, anyway, the point being is that Suetonius has never heard of this either. And then, okay, we go down the list. And we get through Tacitus. And it keeps going. So we've got, I'm looking at my article as I flip through. Oh yeah, all the Christian writings. So the Acts of Peter and the Acts of Pilate, these are forgeries. They're fictions written in the 2nd century, but they relate basically how Peter and Paul got killed by Nero, right? So the persecution of Christians to Christians all throughout the 2nd century. We see this, Tertullian confirms this as well. Tertullian only knows about this, that Peter and Paul were killed by Nero for some more sort of weird, petty political reasons, no knowledge of the fire, no knowledge of connection to the fire.
Could it have been just not lighting, kind of like they hinted them not honoring their gods kind of stuff too?
Well, it's a convoluted narrative. I don't want to get into it. But you can go read the Acts of Peter and the Acts of Paul. There's kind of like sort of political intrigue, yada, yada. Point being is they're not killed for anything to do with the fire, right? They're not killed for arson. There's no fire. Like, it never happens, right?
Like Paul and Thecla, it's like he's like literally telling women not to have sex with their husbands. Like, how ridiculous.
Yeah. I know that's unrelated. Yeah,
It's just the point of
correct.
dying for other reasons.
Yeah, and I'm saying like the Acts of Paul and the Acts of Peter have specific narratives of how this happened, and they're just sort of like petty political narratives. There's no connection to fire. The fire's never mentioned. There's not masses of Christians. There's just Peter and Paul, and maybe a few of their colleagues are killed, right? So that's the only persecution by Nero that even Tertullian has heard of, and Tertullian read Tacitus, so we know he's a reader of Tacitus. So he'd never heard of this burning of Rome connection either. So how could Tertullian have never heard of it, right? So you see how this is stacking up?
You to the position of suspecting, not knowing that this might be an interpolated.
There's something, the sentence about Christ and Pontius Pilate, that if you take that sentence out, the whole passage makes sense as just a description of the Christiani, which are like these Messianic Jews that have nothing to do with Christianity.
Gotcha.
So people think that that's the Jews, because that's what Tacitus originally wrote. That's what I'm saying. And so that would make sense why Tertullian would not mention it, because, well, that's the Jews. It has nothing to do with Christians. And so when he talks about the Christians being persecuted by Nero, he's talking about these Acts of Peter and the Acts of Paul, those legends, right? And we know that because he explicitly says, it's because of the killing of Peter and Paul. He has no knowledge of the fire or anything like that. And the Christians themselves, when they're telling whole narratives about the persecution under Nero, it's just the Peter and Paul stuff. It's nothing to do with the fire. So even Christians never heard of this persecution narrative in Tacitus, right? And it kind of keeps going. There's more. When I mentioned this in the discussion of Pliny, but there's this forged correspondence between Seneca and Paul. So Seneca is this early 1st century philosopher who was close to Nero. He was like one of Nero's, part of his cabinet, let's say. And so he would have been there during all of this. And so they have this correspondence between Seneca and Paul. It's fake. But when they have a letter about this fire, the way it's described in this correspondence is that the Jews were persecuted, that Jews were blamed for the fire and killed, and Christians just got roped in, right? So that means that the forger of this has also never heard of the Tacitus narrative. He's only heard of a narrative, or the current Tacitus narrative. He's only heard of a narrative that the Jews were persecuted, and he's himself inferring and pulling Christians in. Like he's inventing this part of it, that the Christians got sucked in. So that's not in Tacitus either, right? So if he's reading Tacitus, he's reading the version without the line about Christians in it. And so that's another one. And then Eusebius has never heard of it. And Lactantius has never heard of it. And Lactantius was a renowned Latinist, so he would definitely have known Tacitus. In fact, he writes about a persecution under Galerius, or a fire under Galerius, I should say, in which scholars have shown it's a literary lift, it's a mimesis of Tacitus's account, right? So it shows that he knows Tacitus's account, but he doesn't connect it to Christians, so he doesn't know that Tacitus, that was the Christians got persecuted under Nero. He doesn't know this. So he's just borrowing the persecution narrative from Tacitus without any knowledge that it was a persecution narrative about Christians, right? So you have even Lactantius is not aware of this. Eusebius is not aware of this. He wrote a whole history of the church, goes through persecutions. He doesn't mention it.
Important.
Yeah, right. He doesn't know about this. It's not in there.
Historically, he has no, like the biggest 9/11 accusation. Like, how are you not?
And yet knows about Nero and like there's persecutions under Nero, but has no knowledge of it. Right. So the thing is like, and Christian apologists will say, well, maybe this Eusebius just happened to not read Tacitus. Maybe it just wasn't popular or whatever. Like, they can make up an excuse, but when you have to make up excuses for all these sources I listed, right? Now your argument is improbable, right? Like, how probable is it that all these sources had never heard of it, right? Like that's just your excuses don't work at that part, right? You're trying to explain away the evidence.
I have two questions that come to mind in this.
It gets worse, but
Did you want to go ahead and tack that?
I think the last one is Revelation, right?
Yeah,
because I already did Tertullian.
I wanted to actually spearhead that, so let me not derail you. If you want to go into that,
I'll just do it's just Revelation. So Revelation also doesn't know about this. So Revelation's narrative, now of course it's coded, so you have to like interpret it, but
of course,
because it never says Nero, but you can work it out that he's talking about Nero. And its narrative is that Nero persecuted Christians, and then the fire of Rome was God's punishment for persecuting Christians. So even the author of Revelation had no knowledge that Christians were persecuted for the fire. He's thinking of some other persecution, which is probably a reference to the legend that we see in the Acts of Paul and Peter, where it's somehow Peter and Paul got killed in there. And we know we can trace that legend back to First Clement, and it's not really in First Clement, but you can show like a pattern of how people could misinterpret.
What did First Clement? Let's go.
Yeah, you want to go into that? Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, you bet. So First Clement says he's listing a bunch of. He's going through this long list of examples of envy leading to death or disruption or whatever, and because his whole letter is about there's the youth have thrown out the elders in Corinth and have taken over the church, and the elders at Rome don't want this to happen. That's a bad precedent. So like they write this long persuasive homily essentially, and it's meant to be read out. So it's like a speech that it would be delivered, and someone would deliver the speech, by reading it. And it has this long rhetorical argument about, you shouldn't do this, rebellion is bad, it's against God, etc. You should give it back to the elders and set things right. And so they go through all these examples of how things are bad. They do like Esau, and like, they do all of these like legendary like betrayals or whatever that turned out badly. It's like, you don't want to do that, right? And they eventually get to Peter and Paul, implying that some sort of like internal conflict in Christians got them killed, which is interesting. There are some scholars who've written about this, that it looks like Christians got them killed, like trumped up charges and got them like killed in trial of a fake charge or whatever. That this is some sort of envy driven.
And with all the beef that even Paul seems to indicate in the letters, that's not off the table.
Yeah, no, exactly. You're right. Then this is people have talked about, like, there's a lot of reference to these kinds of things. It looks like that might be going on. So anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is that Clement gets to this point, and he describes, he is a sort of florid, he's very florid, like his colorful language and stuff is so highfalutin, it's pompous, really, right? So clearly he was very full of himself and thought he was a great orator. But anyway, so he has this sort of florid description of how Paul, through envy, Paul went to the ends of the earth and got killed, right? And met his glorious end or whatever. And then he goes, and then also Peter and so on. And he says, Peter, the same thing. But with Paul, it's very clear the way he writes, he says ends of the earth, the way it's written, it means Spain. It doesn't mean Rome. So, and Paul says that he's going to go to Spain after Rome in his letters. So this is, Clement seems to know about a persecution that killed Paul somewhere in Spain. And not in Rome, right? So he doesn't say Rome. He doesn't say it's in Rome. He says ends of the earth. But you can take, that's a florid description of, for them, like the common phrase meant Spain. That was considered the ends of the empire, right? The West. I should say the ends of the West is what he says, right? So it's the furthest point of the West. Rome is not the furthest point.
That's like the pillars of Gibraltar, like the pillars.
Yeah. It would be, it would be like saying, someone in Chicago saying Paul went to the West Coast and got killed.
Yeah.
And then you mistaking him as saying that he was killed in Chicago, right? Like that would be, but anyway, so that's what he says. But because he's not explicit, he just says ends of the West. You can see how someone could just say, well, he's writing from Rome, and we all thought Paul maybe was killed in Rome, and maybe ends of the West is some florid way of referring to Rome. And like you could see how someone could misinterpret this as Paul was killed in Rome. But that's not what he said, right? So, and then same with Peter. He just mentions Peter. He doesn't say where Peter is killed. He just says he doesn't say he's been killed with Paul, right? He just says Peter was also killed. So he doesn't say where that happened, when it happened, and so on. But you can see they're juxtaposed. Peter, like it's Paul, then Peter. And if you've assumed that Clement meant Paul was killed in Rome, you might assume that he's talking about Peter also being killed in Rome. And there's an opening line in Clement that's like, we've had recent tribulations here or whatever. And like maybe that's the persecutions. Like you could do this sort of math on Clement and extract Peter and Paul were killed in Rome. You could also say, well, it had to be the 60s, so it had to be under Nero, right? So like you could do this math, and get that. But that's not actually in Clement. You have to kind of interpret it out of Clement. But it's very logical how someone could come with that interpretation.
So you're saying technically anachronistically people look back and they're piecing.
Yeah, and so they create this sort of like Roswell legend of Peter and Paul's death sort of comes to form, right? And then it gets written up in fiction in the Acts of Peter and the Acts of Paul separately. And so and then Tertullian gets this, and now that's the persecution narrative. It's just Peter and Paul were killed by Nero for some petty envious reason. That's what Clement said. Right? Like
this becomes like the way I best describe it is like a magnet where you have when you get so that sucks in.
Yes, all these different ideas get squashed together.
Nero and persecution comes up, you immediately start thinking fires of Rome. It's like it almost becomes the anachronism.
The way the legend accumulates, it's just like Roswell, where it's tinfoil in the desert. But then, no, it was some sort of, it was a special magical material or whatever. But how would no one know about that? Well, okay, so there were these men in black, right? Like, so you're like inventing all of these stories to sort of explain the other parts of the stories. And then eventually you end up with, now it's a flying saucer, Area 51, and we have alien bodies being autopsied, right? And all that happens within 40 years, right? From 1947 to roughly 1980.
Yeah.
You've got the full form myth, right? So it's happened, but it's by accumulating all these separate authors saying all these separate things, they get all pulled together into one master narrative, and then there you go. And so that's kind of, you can trace it from First Clement all the way to Tertullian, and you can see this trajectory. But that trajectory, and it appears to be all the Christians know about Peter and Paul's death. All they know about the Neronian persecution is this legend, which is not the one in Tacitus, right? They've never heard of the one in Tacitus. And so the question is, how could all these people, especially Tertullian, not know about this? How could no Christian, like Christians are writing multiple books about the Neronian persecution, how could none of them know about this? Especially if it really happened, which is another big problem. Like, how could Tacitus know something that all Christians don't know, right? Like about this, right? So anyway, it's like this kind of thing, like there's this, it's extremely hard. It's very, very improbable that Tacitus wrote that line. It's much more probable that he didn't, because that explains all the other evidence. It makes all of this missing data, it all now becomes 100% expected. You expect it not to be in the Acts of Paul or Peter. You expect it to not to be in Tertullian. You expect it not to be in Eusebius, and you expect it not to be in Revelation and all of that. And we were getting to the Revelation point, is where we're rolling back to. Is Revelation says that. Oh, we did discuss that. So like the idea of the fire is something later.
Which is weird in the chronology. It doesn't make sense.
But this, you can see the gravitation now.
The magnet there.
Yeah, right. So you've got it's Nero persecuted Peter and Paul because quote unquote Clement said so. And right after that, the fire was his punishment by God.
Right.
And then, so now they're close, fire and persecution.
Boom.
So like it takes like 200 years, but finally, the forgers of the letters of Seneca and Paul squished them together. And then, you have like, by the time you have Sulpicius Severus, and I should point out, I said Septimius Severus and the other one, that I was confusing it with an emperor. But anyway, Sulpicius Severus is the historian we're supposed to be talking about.
Gotcha.
Sulpicius Severus, and by the time he's writing it, he seems to think that maybe this is in Tacitus, right?
Got it.
Now, but we're not sure, because he doesn't quote the line that we think is interpolated. So we don't know if he's doing the magnet thing, right? If he's looking at the letters of Seneca and Paul and Tacitus, putting two and two together and just saying that, because he doesn't quote the line that we think is interpolated. So we don't know, but it could have been interpolated already by then. So he could be looking at a manuscript that has this line. Like you could see, like forgers of Seneca and Paul, they didn't see that line in there. But then you've got like 40, 50, 100 years of time. You could see a Christian scribes that like looking through Tacitus and saying, oh, is this, I'm going to put a notation here. This is what, Christians must be Christians. It must mean that. That's what's the letters of Seneca and Paul say. Right. And then they put it in the line, and they put the Christ who was killed under Tiberius.
So nobody's confused.
That's right. And then that gets sucked into the text by accident. We know there's processes by which that happen commonly. And so by the time Severus is reading it, like he's seeing it there. But we don't even know that. He might not be seeing that line there. That line might have been interpolated centuries later, because we can't prove from Severus that he knew the line was there, because he doesn't quote it.
Got it.
So anyways, that's the whole story of
you
that.
actually started tapping into my other question that was okay, grant all of this, they interpolated, but why choose this text, or why did this only get interpolated versus, I mean, I guess why insert it so clearly here? Why not get Pliny the Younger? Why not get, why not play with those texts, right?
Yeah.
I
I assume you were getting the answer. Yeah, you're getting it.
Because it's not maliciously.
It wasn't even deliberate. Yeah, it's probably not. Now, also, the argument doesn't work even for deliberate, because You got to assume like most Christians aren't that fucking dishonest, right? Like so, like most Christians aren't gonna mess with the text,
Right.
So like you look at like Josephus, right? You see, like someone, maybe Eusebius, decided to insert the Testimonium Flavianum, right? And you can say like, well, why weren't they inserted everywhere? It's like, well, there aren't a lot that there's only a few dishonest people who are gonna do it. Eusebius, they had to be highly motivated to do it. They chose to do it this one time. They're not going to do it too much because it would give it away. Although there are a lot of things in Eusebius that you could connect to possible forgeries. Anyways, there's a lot that's dubious in Eusebius, but they're not going to overdo it, right? They're not going to insert it everywhere because they're thinking like, what can I get away with, essentially?
Yeah. Or
And so
what's related to.
So the point being is that these interpolations are going to be very rare.
Yeah.
And we know they happen. I can't remember. I calculated the frequency of them is something like, I can't remember how many texts, but something like 1 out of every 200 texts you can that mention Christians have suspect passages in them, and so you could look at like it is a rare phenomenon, but because you have to have this conjunction of events, you've got to have a lawyer willing to do it. You have to have someone who thinks they can get away with it. You got to have someone who's able to do it. Like so, it's got to be someone who controls a library or a manuscript, like Eusebius did, right? So like so that conjunction of events has to happen, and then you get the one or two or three knockoffs, right, of this happening. It's not going to happen everywhere, so you don't expect it to happen everywhere. But especially if it's accidental, because accidental is just random chance, right? Like you can't predict, like no one's doing that deliberately. So like there's a lot of these sort of accidental, and we have like tons outside of it. I'm not saying this is a Christian thing. This is universal. So we have tons of, and I even cite the literature. There's a lot of examples in. Pick any sort of set of literature, whether it's poetry, history, whatever, all the pagan stuff. There's a lot of this happening. Philosophy, it happens a lot of time. These lines that get written in the margins by scholars get sucked in because later scribes mistake it as omitted text.
It's kind of like a commentary that helps you interpret something, and then
it's a footnote that gets sucked in.
Yeah, and then it helps them.
It's more to like when you get a book and you write notes in the margins. It's literally like that. They're called marginalia, and they're literally written in the margins, right? Sometimes in between the lines, sometimes in the margin, right? And some of those, many of those are just comments, like okay, noting notes to yourself, so that you're flipping through the manuscript, you can see the notes. And sometimes they're like notes to remind you that, oh, this is a passage about Jesus, right? Or something like that. And then, but sometimes like there's scribes, because it's all manual, there's no printing press, right? They forget. So you get like this errata mentality, like stuff that got left out. Sorry, in the processing, we forgot to put these sentences in, yada, yada.
Yeah.
But so like you look there and the scribe looks at the original and oh, fuck, I left out a sentence or I left out a word, and they'll put it in the margins or in between the line to indicate that I forgot a word here.
So a later scribe would possibly get confused about the.
Exactly. And there was no standardization for notation. So like if it was a scholarly note or omitted text, there was no standard note. There's no way to tell someone, oh, this is which. So a later scribe's looking at it and they have to decide, is that a scholarly note or is that omitted text? And of course, if you're a Christian and you're passionate, you kind of like, oh, that makes sense. It should be omitted text. It's gotta be, right?
Okay, so one more question before we wrap things up, because we're getting close to time, 7 minutes. Hope you can answer these in under 7. That is, do we have any surviving early manuscripts of Tacitus that don't have it? Okay, I guess what's the earliest in that? And then secondly, are there other scholars who echo the sentiment that this was inserted? That
Yeah, in my article, there's actually been more since I published, and I talk about this in my new book. So Obsolete Paradigm has this. I don't remember if I cite everyone in the book. I think I do. But if I don't, I cite my article, which is republished in Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ. That's the peer-reviewed journal article. That cites everyone before me. Who was like most of them were cited by Van Voorst as well. So like this is a known thing. Like we know there's been a trend in scholarship to argue that this is an interpolation. Since I published, there have been more, and so there's a longer list now of scholars who are making my argument. I'm not by myself on this. So anyway, so that's there have also been scholars who tried to argue that the entire passage is interpolated. And they're wrong, and they're wrong for the reasons that even Margaret Williams says. Like I critique Williams on her critique of my one-line theory, but I don't critique her on the whole interpolation theory. That's bogus. Like that, there's no good argument that the entire thing was interpolated. It's just the one line. That's the only logical, plausible theory that fits all the evidence and so on. But in terms of manuscripts, Tacitus's manuscripts are in a bad state. We technically only really have one. So what we have is we have one that has the first half up to a certain point. And we have another that has the second half with the pace in the middle missing. We have other manuscripts, but they're related to those, so they're not
You can
independent.
tell they're genealogical.
Right, they're not, some of them not directly, but it doesn't matter. But the point being is, like, it really comes down to these two manuscripts, which is really because they're of one piece each. We really only have one, and it's 12th century. So it's 11th, 12th century.
We found something you wouldn't be shocked at all.
Right, right. And the one that has this passage in it, right, which would be like, that's basically, is we're relying on one, late medieval manuscript, really, for this one passage. And we can show that it says Christiani, and then someone erased the E and put I and changed it to Christiani. And so Christiani creates another problem because the way that the line gets interpolated, it says, well, they're called this, it's basically implying that they're called this because of Christ, IST, and ISTUS, right, or whatever. But so it's the I instead of an E. That wouldn't make any sense, right? Like if Tacitus wrote E, why would he write I? That doesn't explain the name, right? So it's an incongruity that doesn't make sense. Margaret Williams tries to argue that Tacitus was telling a joke, that he was like making fun of poor people who don't pronounce things correctly. I don't see any evidence of that in the text. That doesn't make any sense. Like, the joke is kind of like, it wouldn't fit here. It wouldn't explain anything. It wouldn't do anything. There's no reason to believe that Tacitus was telling a joke. It's more plausible he wrote Christiani, and she agrees he did write Christiani, and then he wouldn't have written Christ, right? So I think that's additional evidence. It's not a slam dunk, because you could kind of lean on, I guess, her joke argument. You have to come up with something like that, right? That he's just joking, right? And that's a bad argument. But anyway, it is, it's like logically possible, right? That's the only way you could get from Christiani to Christus being relevant to mention. Otherwise, he would have spelled it Christus, right? Which he totally could have. And so anyway, yeah, that's the that's the story there, and that's goes all the way from the beginning that you were talking about.
Roland, thanks for making this trip, this all happen. And to all the Patreon family, if you will, MythVision, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your questions. And please, if you haven't already, join. Help support us. Thanks.